Good morning. Welcome to Winston-Salem Friends Meeting and our message for the 9th day of August in 2020. As I expect most of you will be aware already, my name is David Teague and I'm a recorded minister in the meeting. And it is my great privilege to be able to deliver the message this morning. So before we go any further, let's take a short while to center down, become still, and listen for what the Spirit of God may have for us. Amen. This morning I wanted to talk about connections. And I wanted to do that by referencing both the book of Amos in the Hebrew scriptures and the production of Shakespeare's King Lear that Sir Laurence Olivier starred in. In fact, it was his last major role in his entire life, which came out in the very early 1980s. And I can just hear some of you going, all right, David, what's the connection between the book of Amos and King Lear, of all things? And how does any of that relate to us right now? Well, those of you who know me know that I have spent essentially the last 2 weeks facing the end of one of the major connections in my life so far. One that goes back over 30 years. In fact, the first tentative part of it goes back to a single afternoon almost 40 years ago now, which tells you how old some of us are getting to be. And the thing about the book of Amos is that Amos was not a professional prophet from either of the Hebrew kingdoms. He was basically a shepherd from the village called Tekoa, which was a bit south of Jerusalem. And he was sent north across the border between the two Hebrew kingdoms from his native kingdom of Judah to the northern kingdom, which was called Israel. And what he found in Israel was a society where the bonds were coming loose. He denounces rich people who are at ease and who think nothing of selling the poor for silver or the needy for a pair of shoes. And his cry was, "Let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream." And those of us who are familiar with the current round of protests in this country know that there are plenty of us who don't think that justice is occurring for many of us, particularly people who are poor and people who are people of color. And that the rich, especially the super rich, have distorted things for their benefit. And in particular, people whose ancestry is primarily European are felt to be most guilty of that. In the early 1980s, I was still at college, and there was a good deal of stir created when it was learned that Sir Laurence Olivier was going to be playing Shakespeare's King Lear, because Lear is one of the most powerful stories that Shakespeare ever penned, for one thing. And for another, Olivier was finally tackling the role of Lear at the twilight of his life. And Lear is the story, if you don't remember, from your own high school days, however many years ago. Lear is the story of an old man. He's a king, and he has 3 daughters, 2 of whom are already married. And he decides that he's ready to go into retirement. And he is going to divide his kingdom between his 3 daughters. So he calls all 3 of them and the 2 sons-in-law in front of him, and he gives them a love test. He wants to know how much they love him. And of course, the 2 older daughters fall all over themselves and each other in playing to their father's vanity and his foolishness. Lear is warned by some of his true advisors that, and above all by his court fool, the court jester could get away with telling the king things that nobody else could very often, because it was the jester's job or the fool's job to function essentially as a sort of prophet and to point out the absurdities of what was going on. So Lear very stubbornly persists in demanding that his daughters tell him how much they love him. And of course, the older 2 daughters, the ones who are already settled and married, play along with this. No doubt they have done this their entire lives. And then he comes to his favorite daughter, his youngest daughter, Cordelia. And he wants to know what Cordelia can add to what her sisters have already said. And she says, "Nothing, my lord." And Lear very pointedly remarks, "Nothing will come of nothing. Think again." But she is very forthright and explains that she is most pleased and most ready to offer her father the love that a daughter is due to offer her father. But that when she does get married, her new husband will exercise a claim on her which is by rights greater than that of her father. And her father disinherits her and says to the two suitors, one is the Duke of Burgundy and the other the King of France, to have come to seek her hand. She's yours if you want her, if you'll have her, because she has nothing from me. And the Duke of Burgundy suddenly remembers something else he has to do, so he leaves. But the King of France is impressed by Cordelia's honesty, and he takes her to be his future wife. And what happens after that is that Lear divides his kingdom into two pieces instead of three, and it's in his mind that he is going to go back and forth between the two daughters he thinks are loyal, with the retinue and the pomp that he is accustomed to having in his life as the king. Well, the daughters don't quite see it that way. They start cutting down on his retinue. They start withdrawing the extravagances of their professed love for him, and and they basically cut his allowance. The fool had tried to warn him. One of his most loyal dukes had tried to warn him, and another, and one to stand up for Cordelia. But of course, Lear was so bent on his earlier course that he banished them. He banished the Duke who tried to stand up to him. And, he finds himself eventually out in a thunderstorm in the open on the heath with the fool and the Duke who tried to warn him, and the son of one of his dukes who had been dispossessed of his rightful inheritance by an illegitimate half-brother. It gets very complicated before things start resolving themselves. But the point that Shakespeare was making, and it's a very valid point for us right now, is that if we don't take care to preserve the bonds that tie us together, no matter what the circumstances are, you get people who are willing to sacrifice their aged parents or their aged grandparents so they can go out to bars or get their hair cut or whatever. And it is surely one of the foundational Quaker witnesses through history that it's the bonds that we share together that help hold us together, not only as a country, but as families, as communities, and as the human race. And in the end, Lear's story has a tragic turn because Cordelia and her husband, the French king, get word of what the two older sisters are doing to their father, and the French invade to try to rescue the old man. And in the fighting, Cordelia is captured and put to death. And that is the final straw that breaks Lear's heart. And a lot of the evil comes from not being able or willing, at least, to recognize those who are actually trying to make things better for us, and not valuing the truth of their service, not valuing the truth of their love. Because when that's gone, it can be impossible to get it back. So the point that I would like all of us to consider and to begin planning ways to do it. Our meeting has a tradition and a history of trying to make things better for our community. We have a history of witnessing to what Abraham Lincoln, in his first inaugural address, called the better angels of our nature. And while we are still in this enforced separation, let us listen to those better angels of our natures. Let us remember our common humanity. Let us go out of our way to remind others of these common bonds we have. The great Jewish Rabbi Hillel, who gave the Jewish version of the Golden Rule, would have agreed that this is part of the entirety of the law and the prophets. Everything else is commentary. And that our job is to go study the commentary. And then later generations of scholars would have added, and to put the commentary into practice. Let us remember our bonds. Let us remember the ties that bind us together in service, in love, and in faith. It has been a very trying 2 weeks for me. Remember me in your prayers, and God bless you all. Amen.